The air backstage was thick and heavy, hanging with the mixed scents of cheap hairspray, strong perfume, and the bitter smell of nervous sweat. It was a chaotic place where people rushed back and forth, carrying cables, microphones, and props, without looking where they were going. The noise was constant and loud, a mix of shouting voices, feedback screeching from speakers, and the heavy thumping of bass from the stage that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes. Elara stood quietly against the cold brick wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. She held a stack of sheet music that was slightly crumpled at the edges from years of use, and she clutched it to her chest, like a shield. Surrounding her were young people who looked like they had stepped out of a glossy fashion magazine. They were tall and thin, with perfect teeth and expensive clothes. Their hair was styled in elaborate updos that defied gravity, and they moved with a confidence that Elara had never known in her entire life. They stretched their long limbs in the narrow hallway and checked their reflections in small hand mirrors, applying layer after layer of lip gloss and mascara, while laughing loudly with one another about jokes that Elara did not understand. She felt incredibly out of place in her modest knee-length skirt and plain white cardigan, which had seen better days, but was the nicest thing she owned. She looked down at her feet, feeling a flush of embarrassment heat up her cheeks as she looked at her sensible black shoes, which were polished but scuffed at the toes from walking to the bus stop every single day for the last 10 years, while the other contestants talked about their vocal coaches and their dance lessons. Elara remained silent. She just watched them and listened to the hum of energy that filled the space a few feet away. A group of 3 young men were harmonizing a pop song with complicated runs and riffs that made Elara head spin. With their complexity, they were good, and they knew it. They strutted around the hallway like they owned the building, and everyone in it stopping occasionally to high-five one another or to shout words of encouragement to their friends. Elara looked at them and then looked away, feeling a sharp pang of doubt in her stomach. She wondered why she had even come here in the first place. She thought about the long drive from her small town and the money she had saved up to make the trip. She thought about the neighbors who had laughed when they heard the news that she was going to try out for a big national talent show. They had told her that she was too old, and that dreams like that were for young people with pretty faces and connections in the industry. She had smiled politely at them and said nothing, but their words had stung more than she cared to admit. Elara closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She could hear the muffled sounds of the current contestants on stage, the audience cheering and the judges commenting through the heavy walls. It felt like a different world out there, a world of bright lights and adoration that was completely foreign to her. She remembered the small church hall where she sang every Sunday morning, a drafty room with peeling paint and a piano that was always slightly out of tune. She remembered the weddings she sang at, where half the guests were chatting and drinking wine while she performed her heart out, and the community center talent shows where she was always the warm-up act for the local dance troupes or the magician. She had spent her life singing in the shadows, finding joy in the music itself rather than the applause. But there was always a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispering that she was capable of more, that her voice was meant for something bigger than empty rooms and distracted audiences. She had practiced for this moment every single day for months, standing in her living room with the curtains closed, singing the same difficult aria over and over again until her throat was raw and her lungs burned. She had studied the dynamics and the phrasing, listening to old recordings of famous opera singers late into the night. She knew she had the talent, and she knew she had the discipline, that standing there in that crowded hallway surrounded by so much youth and glamour, she felt that old familiar fear creeping back in, telling her that she didn't belong, telling her that she was going to make a fool of herself in front of millions of people. A young woman with bright pink hair walked past her and accidentally bumped into her shoulder, causing Elara to drop her music. She quickly knelt down to gather the pages, muttering an apology. Even though it wasn't her fault, the young woman didn't even stop. She just kept walking and laughing with her friends, leaving Elara on her knees picking up her papers. Her hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed out the wrinkles on the sheet music. She looked around to see if anyone had noticed, but nobody was looking at her. She was invisible to them, just a background extra in their movie. Elara stood up and brushed off her knees. She leaned her head back against the hard wall and looked up at the ceiling tiles, which were stained with watermarks. She thought about turning around and walking out the back door. She thought about getting in her car and driving back home, where it was safe and familiar, where people knew her as just Elara from the grocery store or Elara, who sings in the choir. But then she felt a strange calm settle over her. She remembered why she had come. She remembered the feeling of the music in her chest, the way it made her feel alive and connected to something bigger than herself. She remembered the promise she made to herself all those years ago, that she wouldn't give up on her dream, no matter how hard it got or how long it took. The noise in the hallway seemed to fade into the background. As she focused on that feeling, she straightened her back and held her chin high. She wasn't a young girl with a trendy haircut, and she didn't have an expensive team of stylists, but she had something that they couldn't buy or fake. She had years of life and experience woven into her voice. She had heart and soul and a story to tell. The heavy door to the stage area opened, and a production assistant stepped out holding a clipboard, and looking annoyed, he shouted a name that Elara didn't recognize, and a young dancer squealed and ran towards the door, followed by her entourage. The door swung shut behind them, cutting off the noise for a brief second before opening again. Elara knew her turn was getting closer. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, but she also felt a spark of excitement deep down in her belly. She looked down at the faded lyrics in her hands and traced the notes with her finger. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to let a little bit of doubt or a few judgmental stares take it away from her. She smoothed her skirt one last time and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale air of the backstage corridor. She was ready to face the lights, and she was ready to sink. The voice of the production assistant boomed through the hallway, cutting through the noise like a sharp knife, and finally calling out her number. Elara felt her heart jump into her throat as she stepped away from the safety of the cold brick wall. She smoothed the front of her skirt with sweaty palms and took a deep breath to steady her nerves. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for and fearing in equal measure. She walked toward the heavy black door that led to the stage and pushed it open, stepping out of the dim hallway and into the blinding brightness of the arena. The first thing that hit her was the heat from the massive stage lights, which felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She could not see the audience at all, just a vast dark void that stretched out endlessly in front of her. But she could feel them. She could sense the presence of thousands of people shifting in their seats and whispering to one another. The air smelled like dust and electricity, and her shoes made a squeaking sound on the polished floor. As she walked toward the center of the stage, it felt like the longest walk of her life, as if she were crossing an entire desert, rather than just a wooden platform in the middle of a television studio. She kept her eyes forward, trying to ignore the feeling of being exposed and vulnerable like a specimen under a microscope. When she finally reached the microphone stand, she saw the judges' table in the distance. 3 figures sat behind a long desk with nameplates and glasses of water. The center chair was occupied by the head judge, a man known for his sharp tongue and his lack of patience. He was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking bored. Even before she had sung a single note, Elara adjusted the height of the microphone, which was a bit too tall for her, and the metal stand clanked loudly, the sound echoing through the silent theater, causing a few giggles to ripple through the darkness of the crowd. She flinched at the sound and carefully placed her sheet music on the stand, though her hands were shaking so much that the papers rattled against the metal. The host, a young man with a blinding white smile and too much gel in his hair, walked over to her with a brisk, efficient walk. He asked her name and her age in a loud, cheerful voice that felt fake to her ears. She answered him softly, her voice sounding small and thin in the huge space. He nodded quickly and asked what she was going to sing for them today. Elara told him the name of the aria, a difficult and dramatic piece that required incredible vocal control and power. The host raised his eyebrows and looked at the camera with a smirk that suggested he knew something. The audience did not. He then walked back to his mark, leaving her alone in the center of the lights. The head judge leaned forward and squinted at the paperwork on his desk. Then he looked up at her, and his expression changed from boredom to open disdain. He looked at her plain cardigan and her sensible shoes, and then he looked at her face with a sneer. He did not say anything, but he did not have to. He slowly rolled his eyes in a deliberate and exaggerated motion, turning his head so that the woman sitting next to him could see it clearly. The woman judge chuckled softly and covered her mouth with her hand. The third judge, a man with glasses, just shook his head and looked down at his lap. If he were embarrassed for her, the audience caught the interaction immediately, because the giant screens above the stage showed a close-up of the head judge's face. A wave of laughter moved through the crowd. It was not a kind laughter. It was the laughter of people waiting for a spectacle, waiting for something to mock. They had already decided that she was going to be bad. They had decided that she was a joke someone put on the show for laughs. To boost ratings, Elara stood frozen in the spotlight, her face burning hot with humiliation. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn around and walk right off the stage and go back to her quiet life where no one made fun of her, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She looked out at the darkness and felt a wave of anger deep inside her. It was a quiet anger, but it was strong and hot. She thought about all the years of practice. She thought about the sacrifice and the dedication she had put into her voice while other people went out to parties or vacations. She thought about the respect she had for the music and how disrespectful these people were being. Without even hearing a note, the orchestra conductor raised his baton in the pit below the stage. The musicians were silent and ready. The head judge sighed loudly again and tapped his pen on the desk, clearly ready to hit his buzzer and stop her before she even really got started. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and thick, filled with expectation and mockery. Elara took a breath and closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the lights and the faces and the judgment. She planted her feet firmly on the floor and imagined herself back in her little living room where she sang for herself and for the love of the music. She felt the melody. Her mind clear and perfect and beautiful. She rubbed her eyes and looked straight ahead, not at the judges, but at a point far in the distance. She waited for the downbeat. The conductor gave the signal and the orchestra began to play the soft opening notes of the introduction. Elara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped together in front of her, waiting for her cue. The room was tense. Everyone was waiting for the first crack in her voice, the first mistake. They were poised to laugh, ready to destroy her, but Elara tuned them all out. She focused entirely on the breath that was building in her chest, the breath that would become her voice. The moment was just seconds away. The tension was at its breaking point, and the entire arena held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. When the woman in the cardigan finally opened her mouth, the soft sound of the violins drifted through the air of the massive theater, creating a gentle and melancholy melody that seemed to float just above the heads of the audience. The orchestra was playing perfectly, with a rich sound that should have commanded respect and attention, but the people in the dark seats were not listening to the music. They were focused entirely on the woman standing in the spotlight. Elara looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the huge stage lights that shone down on her like a harsh sun. The beams of light illuminated every detail of her face, every wrinkle, every stray hair, and the beads of sweat that were beginning to form on her forehead. She did not move. She stood perfectly still with her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her eyes were fixed on a distant point at the very back of the arena, ignoring the three judges who sat looking at her with expressions of boredom and mild annoyance. Death music began to swell slowly. The cellos and the basses joined in, adding a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of her shoes. The intro to the song was long and dramatic. It was designed to build tension and anticipation, a classic build that led to a powerful and demanding entrance for the singer. The conductor, a man with wild grey hair and intense eyes, kept his gaze locked on Elara, waving his baton with precise and sharp movements. He knew the difficulty of the piece she had chosen. He knew that it required immense breath control and vocal stamina to sing the opening phrase correctly, and he was watching her closely, waiting to see if she would come in at the right time and with the right pitch. Head judge, however, was not watching. The conductor, he had turned his attention to the woman sitting next to him and was leaning in to whisper something in her ear. He made a gesture with his hand that suggested someone talking too much, and then rolled his eyes again for good measure. The woman judge laughed quietly, covering her mouth with her hand to hide her amusement. They were treating the entire situation as a joke, a comedy sketch that was happening live on television. They had already made up their minds before she had even sung a single note. They had decided that she was delusional, that she was an amateur who had no idea what she was getting herself into. The audience picked up on this energy, and the mood in the room shifted from polite waiting to active anticipation. A failure. People leaned forward in their seats, hoping for a disaster. They wanted to see her fail. They wanted to be able to tell their friends later that they were there when that crazy old lady tried to sing opera and embarrassed herself on national television. Ella could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a heavy physical weight. It made it hard to breathe, and her heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard that she was surprised the microphone did not pick up the sound. She felt a sudden wave of panic rise up in her throat, threatening to choke her. She remembered the faces of her neighbors back home, the ones who had laughed at her when she told them she was coming here. She remembered the doubt in the eyes of her own family members who had told her to be realistic and to stop chasing childish dreams. For a split second, she thought they were right. She thought that she was going to open her mouth and nothing would come out, or worse, that a terrible croaking sound would come out and prove them all right. But then the music shifted. The woodwinds began a trill that signaled the moment was approaching. The conductor raised his hand high in the air. The tension in the music peaked, and Elara forced herself to push the panic away. She closed her eyes for just a second and recalled the hours she had spent in the practice room at the community college. She recalled the feeling of the vibrations in her chest when she hit the perfect resonance. She recalled the advice of her old teacher who had told her that the voice is an instrument of the spirit, and that if she sang from her heart, no one could deny her. She opened her eyes again, and her gaze hardened. She was not going to let them win. She was not going to let them turn her dream into a joke. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly, a subtle movement that signaled a change in her internal state that seemed to flicker for a moment as the electric buzz of the theater matched the buzzing in her nerves. She could see the cameraman moving closer to the edge of the stage. The large red light on top of the camera stared at her with blinking eyes. She knew that millions of people were watching this feed at home. She knew that in a few moments clips of her would be all over the internet, either as a laughingstock or as something else entirely. She decided in that split second that she would not sing to impress the judges or to win a prize. She would not sing for fame or money. She would sing for the music itself. She would sing for the little girl she used to be, who sang to the birds in the garden. She would sing for the exhausted single mother who sang lullabies to her children at night. She would sing with all the truth she had inside her. The orchestra reached the final chord of the introduction, a loud and dramatic sound that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, and then suddenly the conductor cut the sound off with a sharp snap of his wrist. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of silence that feels like it has a physical presence, a vacuum, where all the air has been sucked out of the room. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. The judges stopped whispering. Everyone was waiting for the disaster they were sure was coming. Elara took a deep breath, filling her lungs completely and expanding her ribcage. She felt the air rushing in cool and steady. She felt the energy pooling in her diaphragm, ready to be released. She leaned in toward the microphone, her lips parting slightly. The metal mesh of the mic was just inches from her face. The moment was now. There was no more time for doubt, no more time for fear. There was only the music and the breath inside her body. She looked out at the darkness and did not see a crowd of mockers. She saw an empty canvas waiting to be painted with sound. She closed her eyes again to focus entirely on the pitch in her head, and then she let the breath go. The sound that erupted from her throat was not the weak or breathless croak that every single person in the theater had expected it to be. Instead, The first note that came out of her was a deep, rich and resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into the seats. It was a sound that felt physical, like a warm wind that rushed over the audience and made the hair on her arms stand up straight. The clarity of the pitch was absolute. It was a perfect note that hung in the heavy air, shimmering with a vibrato that was so controlled and steady it sounded like a finely tuned instrument rather than a human voice. The effect on the room was instantaneous and violent in its suddenness. The ripple of giggles and whispers that had been moving through the crowd like a wave died a sudden and abrupt death, as if someone had cut the power to the theatre. The silence that followed was not a polite silence. It was a shocked and heavy silence born out of total disbelief. The head judge was in the middle of leaning over to whisper another snide comment to the woman sitting next to him, but when the sound of Elara's voice hit his ears, his body froze mid-motion. His hand was still raised in a gesture of dismissal, but his eyes went wide and snapped away from his fellow judge and locked onto the stage. His mouth opened slightly, the smirk vanishing from his face, replaced by an expression of pure confusion, and all his brain was struggling to process what his ears were hearing, because the sound was so vastly different from the image of the woman standing in front of him. As Elara moved into the second phrase of the aria, the music began to swell, and she moved with it. She did not stand stiffly anymore. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, and her arms rose slowly from her sides, her hands expressive and delicate, as if she was shaping the very air around her. The difficulty of the song she had chosen was immense. It required jumps in pitch that were perilous and risky, demanding a singer to navigate from the lowest depths of their chest voice to the highest peaks of their head voice without cracking or sliding out of tune. But Elara navigated these treacherous musical passages with an ease that looked effortless. She made it sound simple, gliding up the scale like a bird riding a current of wind. Her voice did not waver or break, it only grew stronger and more powerful, filling every single corner of the massive arena. The acoustic engineers in the control booth nearly dropped their coffee because they had set the microphone levels very low, expecting her to be quiet, and they were now scrambling to push the faders up to capture the sheer volume and force of her voice without distorting it. The sound washed over the audience like a tidal wave, clearing away all the prejudice and all the cynical thoughts that had filled the room just moments before. The woman judge, who had chuckled and covered her mouth earlier, was now sitting bolt upright in her expensive leather chair. She had completely forgotten about the camera or the need to look bored and cool. She was staring at Elara with her mouth slightly open and her eyes unblinking. The skepticism had been wiped clean from her face, replaced by a look of utter wonder. She glanced quickly at the other judges to see if they were hearing the same thing, her face flushing slightly with what looked like embarrassment for her earlier behavior. The third judge, who had been looking down at his lap in disinterest, had now taken off his glasses and was leaning forward over the table as close to the stage as he could get. His face was a mask of concentration and respect. His pen lay on the desk in front of him, completely forgotten. He realized that he was witnessing a masterclass in vocal performance, and he was not going to miss a single second of it. In the wings, the other contestants, who had been laughing and stretching just minutes ago, were now frozen in place. A young man who had been practicing his dance moves was standing perfectly still with his jaw hanging open, staring at the back of Elara's head. They realized that this unassuming woman in the modest cardigan possessed a talent and a power that most of them could only dream of achieving. After a lifetime of training, they had judged her by her cover, and they had been horribly wrong. The atmosphere among the waiting contestants had shifted from arrogance to humility, and they watched with a newfound respect as the small woman on stage commanded the attention of thousands of people without even trying. Elara herself was lost in the music. She had closed her eyes to shut out the blinding lights and the sight of the judges' faces. She did not see their shock, and she did not see the audience leaning forward in their seats. She was in a world of her own, a world where the melody was the only thing that mattered. She was not thinking about the competition or the prize money. She was thinking about the meaning of the song. The aria was a story of deep longing and of a love that could never be fulfilled, and she poured her own life experiences into the lyrics. She thought about the lonely years she spent singing to empty walls and the quiet heartbreak of losing people she loved. She used those memories to color the tone of her voice, making it sound achingly beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. Tears began to stream down her face, unnoticed by her, but captured by the high-definition cameras and projected on the giant screens above the stage. The contrast between her plain appearance and the sheer majesty of her voice was striking, and it held the entire arena in a trance. The orchestra was playing with a new energy as well. The conductor was waving his baton with more passion than he had shown all day, inspired by the soloist standing in front of him. The musicians were looking up from their sheet music to watch her. They were playing with more precision and more feeling, feeding off the energy that she was radiating. The music swelled to a crescendo, the drums beating a rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of every heart in the room. Alara stepped closer to the microphone, preparing for the most difficult part of the piece, a long sustained high note that required immense breath support and perfect pitch to pull off successfully. She took a sharp breath, and her chest expanded, and then she released the sound. The high note soared over the orchestra, clear as a bell and incredibly strong. It did not waver or falter. It held steady and true, cutting through the heavy air like a laser beam. It went on and on, defying the limits of human lung capacity, and when she finally eased off the note and let the sound fade into silence, the entire auditorium was left breathless. There was not a single sound to be heard, no coughing, no whispering, just the echoing silence that follows a truly great performance. Alara stood in the center of the stage, with her eyes still closed and her hands clasped over her heart, bathed in the white light, looking like a statue of pure art, and the world waited to see what would happen next. The silence that filled the arena after the last vibration of her voice faded away was so thick and heavy that it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the room. For 3 long heartbeats, nobody moved, nobody breathed, and nobody spoke. The audience sat frozen in their seats, staring at the small woman standing in the pool of white light on stage. The giant screens above the stage showed a close-up of Alara's face, her eyes still closed and her hands pressed over her heart, as she slowly came back from the place where the music had taken her. She looked peaceful and serene, completely unaware of the bomb it had just dropped on the entire theater. The orchestra conductor slowly lowered his baton, a look of total reverence on his face as he watched her. Even the musicians in the pit were looking up at her with smiles on their faces, many of them putting down their instruments to clap their hands softly. Then a sound started near the back of the arena. It was a single person clapping slowly at first, but then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the applause began to grow louder and faster, rolling forward like a massive wave crashing towards the stage. It started as a ripple of appreciation that very quickly turned into a roar of approval so loud that it shook the walls of the building. People began to stand up, first just a few rows near the front, and then the entire back section rose to their feet, until every single person in the theater was standing and clapping their hands above their heads, shouting words of praise and whistling in delight. The laughter and the mockery that had filled the air just a few minutes ago had vanished completely, replaced by a thunderous and overwhelming ovation that seemed to go on forever. Alara slowly opened her eyes and blinked a few times against the bright lights. She looked out into the darkness where the sound was coming from, and for a moment she looked confused, not quite understanding what was happening. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the thousands of people standing and cheering for her, and the reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks, but these were not tears of sadness or nerves, they were tears of relief and pure joy. She brought a shaking hand up to her mouth to cover a sob, and looked around the massive space in disbelief. She had dreamed of this moment for so many years, but she had never dared to imagine that it would feel this powerful or this validating. Down at the judges' table, the scene was one of total transformation. The head judge, the man who had rolled his eyes and treated her with such disdain, was now standing with his hands braced on the table, leaning forward as if he wanted to be closer to the stage. His face was pale and his usual confident smirk was nowhere to be found. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, but in the best possible way. He exchanged a look with the woman judge next to him, and she simply shook her head and smiled, shrugging her shoulders, as if to say she had no idea what just happened either. The third judge was already clapping enthusiastically and nodding his head in time with the music of the applause. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The powerful were now humbled, and the underestimated had been lifted up. The host walked back onto the stage, but he did not have his fake bright smile on his face anymore. He looked stunned and perhaps a little bit ashamed of how he had treated her when she first walked out. He stood next to Elara and waited for the applause to die down just a little before speaking into his microphone, but it took a long time for the noise to fade enough for him to be heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and respectful, and he did not make any jokes. He simply asked the judges for their thoughts. The head judge picked up his microphone and cleared his throat nervously. He looked out at the audience and then looked directly at Elara. His eyes were sincere and filled with a newfound respect. He told her that in all his years of doing this job, he had never been so wrong about someone. He admitted that he had judged her by her appearance and by her age, and that it was a mistake that he would not forget. He told her that her voice was a rare gift that moved him in a way he had not been moved in a very long time, and that he was honored to have been there to hear it. The audience cheered again at his honesty, and Elara felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She did not need an apology. She needed to be heard, and finally, she was hard. Woman judge spoke next, and she told Elara that she had tears in her eyes, and that the performance was not just a singing performance, but a lesson to everyone watching about never giving up and about looking beyond the surface. She told her that she was a star and that she deserved to be on that stage more than anyone else they had seen that day. The third judge agreed and added that the technique was flawless, but the emotion was what really set it apart. He said that was the kind of voice you only hear once in a lifetime. Elara listened to their words with her hands clasped together in front of her, looking humble and grateful. She did not speak with arrogance or anger. She just nodded her head and whispered a soft thank you into the microphone. She told the host and the judges that she was just a woman who loved to sing and that she was grateful for the chance to share her music with them. She said she hoped that her being there would show other people that it is never too late to follow your dreams, no matter what other people think or say. Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the now silent room, and her words were met with another round of warm applause. The host told her that she was going through to the next round of the competition, which was really just a formality at that point, because everyone knew she belonged there. The music swelled again, the triumphant sound of the exit music playing as Elara turned to walk off the stage. She paused at the edge of the platform and looked back one last time at the judges and the audience. She smiled a genuine and radiant smile that made her face light up, and she waved to the people who had just minutes ago been ready to laugh at her. She walked down the steps and into the wings where the other contestants were waiting for her. Soon as she stepped out of the spotlight, the young dancers and singers who had ignored her earlier rushed towards her. They were clapping and shaking her hands. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they told her how amazing she was and how much she had inspired them. The air of arrogance was gone from the hallway, replaced by a feeling of camaraderie and respect. They looked at her not as an old lady in a cardigan, but as a master of her craft, a teacher who had just given them the most important lesson of their lives. Elara accepted their praise with grace and kindness, hugging them and thanking them for their support. She walked slowly to the dressing room, her legs feeling like jelly after the rush of adrenaline and emotion. When she opened the door and sat down in the chair in front of the mirror, she looked at herself for a long time. She saw the same face she had seen that morning, the same grey hair and the same tired eyes, but she also saw something new. She saw a woman who had taken a chance and had proven her worth. She felt a sense of peace settle over her that she had never felt before. She knew that whatever happened next in the competition did not really matter, because she had already won. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and she had found her voice. Elara closed her eyes and took a deep breath, smelling the dust and the hairspray and the lingering scent of her own perfume, and she smiled knowing that her life would never be the same again because she had finally dared to be seen.